Welcome back to the bench. I'm Paul, and today we'll be painting these White Stork figures for my 1/72 scale Ravel Nashorn. The figures represent German troops at the Battle of Kharkov and come in a blister plastic box, sealed in a plastic bag and protected by 3 packing peanuts. The poses are quite neutral, all 3 standing, with the commander figure examining a map. These are resin figures and come on 3 casting blocks. As I'm sure you can see, the quality of these figures is extremely high. Each of the 3 figures have a distinctly different face and realistic proportions. The same quality can be observed on the main body pieces, equipment is well represented and the fabric folds are realistic, better than many 1/35 scale figures I painted in the past. More visible on camera than they are to the naked eye are some layer lines, which suggest that the masters of these figures were originally 3D printed. Cleanup is minimal, with no real moulding lines down the sides and only some flash between their legs. However, I was concerned with the way the MP40s were casted. Both have a support connecting to the extremely fragile barrels. I started by doing the little work required to get these figures ready for painting. I took my knife and I cut away the extra resin from between their legs. I decided to leave the main figures on the casting block for painting. This will make them much easier to handle without damaging the paintwork. I tried to take care when cutting out the shoulder slang MP40 piece, but my earlier fears were confirmed when I snipped the barrel and it broke. Luckily, I have this old box of prizer figures, which I knew had some spare kit I could use as donor pieces. I've often heard great things about prizer figures, so I took one off the sprue out of interest to compare it to the much newer White Stork ones. The White Stork figures are certainly finer, but I'll let you decide how much of an impact that truly has at this scale. Comparing the MP40s, I dare say I prefer the more cartoony, injected molded versions. The trigger guard is clearer, and the exaggerated features are a bonus for me at this scale. I chose one with the stock extended for a change, and I superglued it into place. I then grabbed some VMS black superglue and began to assemble the figures according to the box art render. Luckily, the commander's submachine gun survived this time and fit well onto the main piece. Apart from heads, that concludes our very complex assembly. I thought it would be interesting to continue our prizer comparison, so I chose one with a suitable cold-looking pose and I scraped away the mold lines. There are various heads across the set, more heads than figures, so I chose one with a soft cap that I liked the look of and I cut it from the sprue. Again, I cleaned up the mold lines and stuck it to the body before attaching the figure to a waste piece of resin, again helping with painting. Here you can see the difference between the 2 brands. White Stork wins this round. The prizer head is fine, but much bigger, and the overall figure is not as well proportioned. I know it's not an apples to apples comparison, but let me know in the comments how you think these figures compare. Back to the trusty matte black primer, sprayed through the airbrush, but as previously, a spray can would work just as well. At this point, I also began researching German uniforms at this time of the war, and I quickly came across this dragon set of 35th scale figures. A useful reference, but one that raised a few questions. I found the similarities in pose, uniform, and equipment across these 2 sets extremely striking. Perhaps they're both based on a historic photograph? If you recognize them from one, then let me know in the comments. I used Army Painter's tanned flesh to base coat the exposed skin on faces and hands, applying 2 thin coats to preserve as much detail as possible and not flood the tiny features on these faces. I always like to try to start with a darker skin tone and build up to my highlights, so once the tanned flesh was dry, I used a lighter tone to highlight the upper areas. The process for these figures was mostly the same as the one that I use on 35th scale figures. I focused my highlights on raised areas, starting with the T shape formed by the nose and forehead, before sweeping across the upper cheek, below the eye, connecting the nose to the bottom sides of the forehead. Finally, I pick out details around the mouth and the chin to define them on the sculpt. I repeated these steps on the resin figures. This is a good first step to get familiar with the sculpts of each face, but still doesn't push the contrast too far. For that, I grabbed some Army Painter washes and carefully painted them into the recesses on the face, such as the eyes and the mouth. I don't want to paint it over the full head here, the intention is to add contrast rather than to shade the whole piece. We don't need to be perfect here, there are more highlights to come, so this is just about making artificial shadows on the face. We can push the contrast to the full by mixing in some of our white skin tone and again picking out our main highlights from earlier, though this time covering less area than our original pass. The harsh highlights helped to make these faces look more gaunt and cold, and the effect was pushed further with a dark red and cool purple wash to give them freezing rosy cheeks. I began to work up levels of highlight with a dark grey paint on our commander. The sculpts of these figures made painting easy. I'm just moving around the figure, picking out raised fabric folds and adding a light gradient across flat areas. I'm aiming to cover about 70% of the figure, and I'm happy to leave the black showing through, along seams and recesses to serve as shadows and to push contrast. At this scale, the more distinct we can make the details, the better. Excuse the blurry video in this shot, but at this stage I mixed in some olive drab with our grey to replicate the German overall colour. This followed a similar highlight pattern to the previous layer, but this time aiming to cover about 50% of the overall figure. This is a satisfying and impactful step. As always on these figures, I'm using multiple thin layers to build up opacity without losing the cast detail. My final highlight, on only about 10% of the surface, was strictly used on details at the very top of the figure, such as the collars, shoulders, and raised folds. These steps don't need much skill or even a tiny brush, just a decent point and a bit of patience to build up the layers. I picked out details such as straps, map cases, and the MP40 with their respective colours on the main figure, and then used silver and grey to render the cap. With this done, I snipped the head at the bottom of the neck, clipped away the excess resin, and then used black superglue to fix it in place. With a careful black pin wash, I was happy to call the first of our 4 figures complete. I'm quite pleased with this result for a subject less than 2.5 centimeters tall. I thinned down AK's 3rd generation white significantly, and I used it to do a very thin base coat over the figure in his snow camo uniform. This layer was then followed up by a subsequent thicker layers of white, building up opacity around areas of highlights such as raised folds exactly like the previous figure. The easiest way to paint white is to paint grey. If we just hit the highlights with the brightest white tones at the end, then this whole figure will read as wearing white while still having depth in terms of highlight and shadow. Again, the quality of these sculpts struck me here. I was never unsure of where to place my highlights, and so these figures were a total breeze to paint. I always watch out for vague, wavy textures on uniforms like the old Tamiya ones had. The sculpts on those figures made them way harder to paint than these ones, even though they're a much bigger canvas. With the white still out, I repeated the process on the trousers of our infantry soldier with the magnetic anti-tank mine in his left hand. This let me reset my focus from our all-in-white figure, and then when I came back to him it let me see a few areas that needed some extra highlights. A dark green base coat over our winter jacket made a huge difference to how complete this set looked. I applied it more like a highlight than a base coat, with plenty of black still showing through to create more of those artificial shadows we've spoken so much about already. I made sure it was opaque on the upper half of the coat, especially on the jacket sleeves and on his shoulders. This meant that when we came along with our next highlight step, a much lighter highlight tone, that the jump wasn't too stark. This highlight was reserved for just the most prominent areas, his lapels, his jacket hood, and his shoulders to be precise. When mixed with some of our original green, it could also be applied to other areas on the front of the figure. By painting the front of the figure lighter than the back, we automatically direct people to view the sculpt from its best angle. We'll reinforce this with our basing in the next video. The name of the game is truly just lots of thin coats of paint. We can add a medium green tone and a glaze over our work so far to smooth out our blends and any areas that we maybe pushed our contrast a bit much. This prizer figure really looked like he was freezing, and I suppose he would be without any winter gear, so I grabbed a few grey paints and repeated the highlight base coat from before. You can hopefully see in this footage that I'm not trying to cover everywhere. I'm just using a small brush to show off our upwards facing surfaces. I don't bother painting the crease between his legs. If we leave it black now, we can save ourselves a wash step later on. This process is also quite clear to see on the jacket. Only a few of the raised surfaces need a highlight in order to give the entire jacket the appearance of being grey. And with that, we were done our largest areas and we were on to the detail painting stage. If it's not obvious from watching so far, I'm a big subscriber to the getting dressed figure painting method, where you start with the skin and you work your way up through the layers in the order that you might put them on. Ammo pouches after belts, after jackets, after shirts, and so on makes it much easier to avoid overspill onto our detail areas. To add some grime, and as a form of insurance for our highlighting, I put some brown wash into select areas of the figures to darken them and force that final bit of contrast. The truth is, there are details on these sculpts that are near impossible to paint with regular paint layers, but a quick enamel wash will settle into those sculpted details and make things like the infantryman's inner jacket or the buttons on the white uniform legible. Finally, my rattiest brush and a stippling of white created the effect of worn and damaged whitewash paint on the Stahlhelm of our middle soldier. That wrapped up our painting on these guys and we were ready to glue in the heads. I snipped them off the sprues and made sure the connection points had been cleaned up on both head and body. With a drop of black super glue each, I dropped the heads in and I adjusted them to my own liking. As for our prizer experiment and the few bits of equipment, they also got a touch of super glue before they were each dropped into their forever home in the crew compartment and to add some life to the interior. Thank you so much for watching the third video in this Nashorn series. Last episode I said that I'd be amazed to hit 100 subscribers by the end of this project, and at time of recording we're at 99 with only 2 of 4 episodes released. I can't express enough my gratitude for everyone taking the time to watch these videos and support me on this new venture into the world of YouTube. I'll see you in the next one.